Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 51st episode of the Diverse Minds podcast. Carrying on the spirit of South Asian Heritage Month and breaking stigmas and myths, particularly in relation to South Asian women, I'm speaking to British South Asian author Mahsuda Snaith. I'm also super lucky to call her a good friend and colleague who helps me work out my business blogs. Born in Luton to Bangladeshi parents, Mahsuda Snaith is a writer of short stories and novels. She's the winner of the SL Leeds Literary Prize and Bristol Short Story Prize. Her debut novel, The Things We Thought We Knew, was chosen as a World Book Night book, and her second novel, How to Find Home, has been read on BBC Radio 4. She was also named an Observer New Face of Fiction in 2017 and was a judge for the Costa Book Awards in 2019. Mahsuda has led creative writing workshops in universities, hospitals, schools, and in a homeless hostel. And she's also a commissioned writer for the Colonial Countryside Project, which explores the colonial connections of National Trust properties. So I'm so delighted to have her on the show. Welcome to the show, Mahsuda.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It's such an honour, and I know our listeners are going to love hearing what you have to say. So I've just introduced you and I've read out your bio. So I'd really like to know, Mahsuda, and I'm sure our listeners would too, how did you get into writing?
So for me, I'm one of those annoying people who kind of knew from a really young age that I wanted to be a writer. So I remember sitting in just an ordinary kind of primary school lesson, English lesson, and the teacher putting up a book and saying, you get illustrators to draw the pictures and you get a writer to write the words and a publisher to publish the book. And I was like, what? Writing can be a living. I'd never really occurred to me before that point, and I loved writing and I loved reading, and from that point on I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. So it was a pretty long slog after that. It wasn't a quick overnight thing. It was many years of writing and reading and sending things off, but that was really the impetus where it began.
And so your 2 books to date, and please do mention those and talk about those. How did you develop the themes for those books?
So my first novel, which became The Things We Thought We Knew, I actually started writing the first draft of that when I was 16. And I think at that point, I'd written a lot of short stories and had a go at kind of copying novels that I really liked. But this was my first go at actually sitting down, trying to write a whole novel that was completely original. I literally wrote one draft of that and just went, I had a really nice notebook, just wrote it from beginning to the end. And then left it thinking that, I've written a whole novel, being quite naive about it. And it wasn't until kind of I reached my 30s when I went back to look at that novel, and I'd had a go at writing several other things, that I thought, there's a lot wrong with this, but there's a lot I really still love. So my first novel is set on a council estate in Leicester with a British Bangladeshi central character, and that was very much my upbringing. So it was probably the closest I would get to writing kind of autobiography, except the character is very different from me. So I thought, I still really love these characters. I still really love the fact that it is set where it is. And so I decided to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. And that's kind of where I began the second kind of wind with that novel, and then sent it out to lots of competitions. And then I used to send out things to everything. So short story competitions, novel competitions, and hadn't really got a lot of response during that period. But in 2014, for some reason, I became a finalist in the Miss Lexia novel competition with the novel. I won the SI Leeds Literature Prize, which is for Black and Asian female writers. And I won the Bristol Short Story Prize with a short story, all in the same year. And I just feel like that just really helped propel my kind of profile, and I got agent interest, and then via that agent interest I was able to get the first book published, which was The Things We Thought We Knew. And then with the second book I got a 2-book deal, which was a really good thing to get, because you don't feel the pressure of the first book having to do immensely well for you to move on to the second. And I was in a good position because I'd already started writing a second novel, and that one was a complete departure I wanted to write about something that wasn't about me. So I have always been fascinated by the lives of homeless people and what that experience is really like. So I did a lot of research for that. The good thing about my first novel is that I didn't need to do a lot of research for that, because I grew up on a council estate and I'm from a British Bangladeshi family. But for this one, I did a lot of kind of reading books, watching documentaries, and working in and volunteering in homeless charities, as well as charities that work with sex workers, and really deeply researched the subject of homelessness. And to write my second novel, which was How to Find Home, which I know can sound quite dark because it's about homelessness and dark subjects, but I wanted to be an uplifting book. So it really is kind of based loosely on the Wizard of Oz storyline and has hopefully an uplifting feeling behind it. And that was published a couple of years ago.
And so, Mahsuda, would you say that you like to write about contemporary, challenging, big issues and big questions and put them into an accessible way, but of course it's a story?
Yes, that is definitely, I am more drawn to those big topics, those the things that, and also the things that we don't really explore a lot, especially in literature. So growing up, I hadn't seen many books with Asian characters in it. So that, and especially with a kind of council estate setting that wasn't all negative. So it was important for me to create a novel that kind of counteracted that. And again, with the homelessness and How to Find Home, I hadn't ever read a fiction book about homelessness. And in fact, when I researched into books that had been written, there's some biographies and autobiographies about homelessness, but I couldn't find any fiction books about homelessness. So I really am drawn to topics that maybe haven't been explored before and deal with big themes, but yes, like you say, hopefully in an accessible and enjoyable format.
And so, you mentioned that you were a teacher before, and how did you feel confident? Because I'm sure a lot of people will be listening to this and maybe they've got their books and their manuscripts and their things squirreled away. And how were you able to transition, in effect, from being a teacher to a writer full time?
So it was very much in my consciousness, even when I decided at 8 years old that I was going to be a writer, that I would need another job on the side to supplement the writing. So I loved kids from a young age, and I knew that teaching would be an avenue for me. So I very consciously decided to be a primary school teacher with the aim of being able to write as well. As any person who knows or is a primary school teacher will tell you, that it's a very intense job and takes up the majority of not only your day but your evenings and weekends. So the balance I eventually found was to be a supply teacher and work on a certain amount of days and use other days for writing. And it was only really working part-time that I was able to do it, because I honestly don't know how I would have been able to do the writing otherwise. So I think really it is a case of seeing where you can find slots, seeing where you can squeeze in that writing time, because a lot of the success of writers, I think, is having time to write. So if you can somehow squeeze that in to your working week, or if you can block out like a few weeks in your year to just really get down to writing, it will make the world of difference.
And that's a really helpful practical tip, I think, because you don't have to do it all in one go, do you, as you said? And you said something really powerful, which was finding the time and making it regular. So making it a regular, consistent practice, I think, is one of the other keys.
Yes, definitely. I think having a regular practice is good for you mentally, so that you are gradually telling yourself that you are a writer, because it takes a while sometimes for some people to accept that particular moniker. But also it's, I think, really good for you personally to know that this is my writing time. This is for me. This is for what I'm working on. And I actually schedule it into my diary as a job. Before it was a job, I treated it as a job, an enjoyable job. It was very much my hobby as well, but I scheduled it in to be as important as other work that was paid. And I think that's important mentally. If you really want to have a go at this writing thing or art or whatever it is you're going for, is to really take it to that serious level.
Hmm. And you also mentioned your culture. So you said, your culture, you're British Bangladeshi woman. Part of your culture has been growing up on a council estate. But so how, obviously that's really informed your first book. But how do you think your culture, and of course your culture is going to be much wider than the two facets that I've just described. But how else do you think they influence your writing style?
I think it's an interesting one because I grew up on a council estate that was majority white, and didn't have any other Asian people on it apart from our family. We live next to an area that is predominantly Asian, predominantly Gujarati, Indian and Hindu. But the council estate I grew up on was majority white. So I always had this feeling of not being quite knowing what my culture was, other than, the foods my mum cooks and kind of the little kind of phrases she would use and elements of that. And then even when I went to secondary school, I'm British Bangladeshi and was brought up Muslim, so it wasn't a case of I went to the secondary school that was in the Asian area and everything. I felt like I was suddenly culturally aligned because we had very different cultures. But what I think I've learned, especially recently, is those differences really are the things that you can bring to your writing and make it unique. So I do have a different perspective as a British Bangladeshi person growing up in Britain, and growing up on a council estate, growing up away from family who are British Bangladeshi as well. So using all those elements, I think, are really useful in your writing and will come out. And I'm finding I'm using that element a lot more. And I think as writers, you do always write about the outsider. It kind of is part of our tradition as writers, and I think readers are drawn to that. So I think using all of those different elements, like you say, of those wider cultural things and micro of those differences, and not seeing them as necessarily bad things, but actually things that are really interesting to explore, has definitely helped me in my writing process.
Yeah, thank you, Mahsuda. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? I'm not a writer, as you know. I'm always moaning about that. But but that
we could be one day.
But we have talked about this, haven't we? About feeling like inside outsiders. And even though my background's very different to yours, that I didn't grow up with my extended family either, and kind of how that does give you an insight. And you're a writer, and you write about inclusion, exclusion, cohesion, and things that don't work for people as a result of that. And I do inclusion work in a more practical sense. And that's the other thing. So one of the things I've been talking about during South Asian History Month or Heritage Month is that there isn't one Asian perspective, there isn't one Asian experience. And I think it's so helpful for people to hear about your background and kind of how you define yourself, because there isn't the Asian experience, and we talk about that quite a lot, don't we?
Yes, and I think this is something I've only really realised myself in probably the last few years, because when I was growing up, I really felt like I should be feeling like I'm part of this Asian community. And when people say, "Oh, what does your community think?" I always found that really difficult, because my community was a white council estate in Leicester. So the assumption is your community is the Asian community, and that you can somehow speak for everyone. But yes, like I've said, recently I've really learned that everyone's experience as an Asian person is going to be different depending on different elements. And we can obviously unite, I think, over being South Asian. And I'm really glad that we've got a South Asian Heritage Month, because I think we can kind of ignore our own heritage. So we can unite over certain elements, but also realize that we don't just assume that everybody has the same experience.
No, absolutely. And on that point then, really, what would you advise other South Asian women or writers of colour, aspiring writers of colour, who want to be writers and follow their hearts and go for it, but maybe they're scared, no one wants to read what they've written, maybe they're scared that it won't resonate with people, maybe they're scared, or maybe they're concerned that it's what they're doing is too niche? What would be your advice?
I think writing and any kind of artwork or any kind of thing, when you're really putting out a part of yourself, which you really are with writing, is a scary process. I think it's doubly scary if you come from a minority group, especially if you don't see yourself represented in the artwork or the books or music or whatever it might be, because you get that message from those kind of kind of seeing those things that, or not seeing yourself even, that your voice isn't as relevant. And I would 100% say that your voice is relevant. And actually, I think if anything we've learned from the Black Lives Matters movement recently is we need more of those voices. And just because there are people there are guardians of the gates, and they will say things that will discourage you and make you feel like that you need to conform to a certain type of writer. But I would really encourage anyone who has that need in them to get a story out, to tell it in the way that they only they can do it. And that doesn't mean that you have to write it in a certain way. That means you have to do it in the way that you want to write it. And I really believe that if you produce something that's kind of from your soul and from from your heart, and you work on it, that's very important, that you work on the craft and you try and get it to be the best you can get it to be, somebody will see the potential in it and will take it forward and then hopefully develop it. It's not an industry that's particularly known for being incredibly diverse, publishing. They are trying to work on that. They've been trying to work on that for many years. But I think with the Black Lives Matters movement, I've seen a change in the way that people are approaching diversity in publishing. It very much felt like lip service for many years. We're going to do this scheme. They do the scheme, and then that's it. That's their little tick box of diversity done. This time around, I feel like people are reading more writers, especially Black writers, are really thinking about how we can make that consistent change that will last in publishing. And so, if anything, this is the perfect time to be writing your story as a South Asian woman, and really do not think of the market. It's really difficult not to when you're writing, but you can think about that after you've done the writing. But when you're creating, just create the thing you need to create.
And I suppose the other thing to say is, compared to when we were growing up, Mahsuda, it's really great that there are all these online platforms. So there's Burnt Roti magazine, there's Galdem, there's Amalia. I'm just naming a couple. There's South Asian Sisters Speak. So yeah. I suppose that's really positive, and I know that's a really great platform for people to start writing and experimenting in a safe way and in a supportive community. I also just wanted to say, thinking about publishing not being very diverse, and I've seen it firsthand from living in Oxford, in Oxford, and Oxford University Press, and the staff going in there every morning are kind of quite homogenous. I'm going to be bold and say that. So how have you been pigeonholed as a writer, and how do you push back against that? So, of course, your second book, your characters, your main character isn't Asian, and why should they be? It's a person, it's about homelessness. So how were you able to push back against that, and what are the ways in which you've been pigeonholed?
I think it was just to reference that, really. It was important for me to write. The second book was to not have an Asian. I wasn't actively saying I'm not going to write about an Asian person, but when the character came to me, she wasn't Asian. And I know that sounds strange, but that kind of happens with writers. And also then I thought, if I make her Asian just because I'm Asian, am I then going to be because people do this, they'll read a book and it's an Asian character who's homeless and think, oh, this is an Asian issue. And it's like, I really wanted to make it clear this was not an Asian issue. This is an issue that can affect absolutely anyone. So that was a very active decision to not specify her race or to specifically say that she was from an Asian background. In terms of publishing and pigeonholing, it's really difficult to know when you're being pigeonholed or what people are expecting from you, because they keep those things and say those things behind closed doors. So it's a tricky one. But I do know that I went into, when I got my book deal, that I was very adamant in my head that I did not want any saris on my cover. I didn't want this kind of exoticism kind of placed on my books, because I've noticed as an avid reader that the books that from Asian writers that seem to do well, especially in the 90s, were usually set in our home country. So India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and those were the ones that were successful. I'm a British Bangladeshi writer, so I don't have I have some experience in Bangladesh, but it was maybe a few months when I was 19. So a large majority of my experience was in Britain, and that's the type of story I want to write about. And I feel, I've not experienced anyone saying this to me, but I do feel that there isn't a good variety of that in actual literature. And actually people kind of, I think, especially when it comes to literary or kind of literature with a capital L, people want the exotic. So I really didn't want that. I think, and also I remember an African writer telling me about covers and how he had to really push back against them wanting, his story was set in an African village and they wanted to put palm trees on his cover, and there are no palm trees in an African village. So he had to really push that. And it's just those micro level little details that do make the big difference, because my book isn't about samosas and saris. There's some samosas and saris in there, okay, but that's not what it's about.
No, the proverbial fun, food and flags. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's the way that I want to write about the British Asian or the British experience, because that's the experience I've had. That doesn't mean that it's not anymore. It can't be universal. It can have universal themes. But yes, that's what I've been interested in. And I'm not sure if the only time actually, because I thought about this question earlier, that I feel like sometimes you get pigeonholed kind of in a far more visceral way, in a real life way, is when I do Q&As at book festivals. The question I always get, and I don't believe it's a question that white authors get, because I've never heard a white author being asked this, but what do your parents think of you being a published writer? Which I think comes very much from an assumption that your parents wanted you to be a doctor. And what do they think of you being a creative person? And the ironic thing is my mum was very behind my writing. She's always been behind my writing. She also was very behind me getting an education and getting a job, a paid job while I was writing. But she was never told me not to write. So I find it such a strange question to ask. So it's kind of in the kind of microaggressions and micro kind of details that you kind of get these little messages that you should be writing about a certain thing, and that you're an Asian writer, so you should have had this experience. That kind of comes through.
And you know what, Mahsuda, sometimes it's not very micro. I mean, you know, it's this single flipping story that I'm so bored of hearing. And I love your first book, and I've still got to read your second book, because I just love the fact it's not about arranged marriages. It's not about, the mother character, Amma, has not match made her daughter. And I just loved that. That's what I loved about it. It was about someone who's writing about their childhood friend. Don't want to spoil it for people, but yes. So yeah, I really loved it, and it really resonated with me, even though I don't know what it's like to grow up on a council estate. But some of it's not micro, you know. These assumptions are really toxic, because then what happens is talent gets overlooked and the system doesn't change. So, you know, I think it was really helpful you mentioned around, you know, there'll be an initiative and then it'll be forgotten about. And that is very much, I feel, about putting the onus on the writer of colour, and then saying, oh, we've had that scheme, and not looking inwards with the publishing industry and thinking, what do we need to change? It's easy to stick a plaster on a mouldy wound, but it's not easy to kind of dig in and clean the wound and make it better, is it?
Yes, and I think, I mean, I read a great article by Bernardine Evaristo talking about this, and how the onerousness is always put on the Black or Asian writer. So we have these diversity panels in literature festivals, and it's full of brown people, because when they say diversity, they're not talking about LGBTQ, or they're not talking about disabled writers. It always, when I turn up to a diversity panel, it's about being a BAME writer, but they don't have the publishers on the panel. They don't have the people in power on the panel. And it was such a good point that she made, that, you know, we are not the guardians of the gate. We need the guardians of the gate to be there to explain why there is not more diversity in publishing. We don't know. We're the ones that are getting excluded. So we need those people. And yes, I think we're getting a bit of a change with that, and a bit more of a dialogue about that. But yes, I was very sick of seeing the same stories when I was growing up. So I would be so excited if I saw an Asian writer on a bookshelf, and I would read about it, and it would be either arranged marriages or terrorism
Yep.
or something that was a stereotype. And that's 100% what I wanted to do with my first novel, was to have an Asian character, but and her being Asian definitely influencing her character as it did me, but that not being the story. Have it on a council estate, but and have influences from that, but it not being about being on a council estate. It's a story about someone recovering from a childhood trauma, which is something I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think we need to change the rhetoric. And yeah, anyway, if you want to know more, last week's podcast episode is all about why Asian women are more than a single story. So I'll stop us there. And so thinking about writing and mental health then, so I always ask my guests about how they look after their mental health and their top tips. So what are the ways in which writing benefits your mental health and mental well-being?
I think for me, writing has always been to do with well-being for me. As a child, growing up in a council estate where I wasn't really allowed out because my mum didn't want me to mix with the kids on the council estate, and not really having and also I was incredibly shy. So I would now say I probably had social anxiety. So I was an incredibly shy child. My only real access to the world was via TV and books, and then eventually via writing. Because I think by escaping into other people's worlds, and especially the world of the written world, because you have to create that world in your head, you kind of connect with the world in a strange way. And that's definitely what I found with writing. It was my way of expressing myself, because I couldn't express myself verbally to people. I was so shy. It was my way of connecting with the world without really, being able to go into the world myself. And so it's always been a part of my kind of well-being practice, if you want to put it that way. And it's definitely still something I use. So I use writing. I tried to actually stop writing in my early 20s when I graduated from university. I did an English and education degree. I was planning to be a teacher anyway, but by that point, I think the English lit side of the degree had just really killed the creativity out of me, because I was just analysing everything and thinking, what does this line mean? And is it post-feminist? Is it what does it what's the meaning behind everything? And it just killed writing for me. And then what I found is that when I wasn't writing, so I stopped writing for a bit, is I was absolutely miserable. It was the thing I needed to express myself. It was the thing I needed to release kind of pent up feelings. So that was such a good experience for me, because I knew after that point that even if I didn't get published, I needed to write. It's a fundamental part of who I am. And even now, I will, if I'm having a problem now, I will write it out. That seems to be the way for me to deal with issues, is to write it out. There's something about the brain to the pen or to the keyboard that works for me. So I think it can be such a good thing for mental well-being. And I know a lot of people journal for that reason as well, just to get something out. Because I think there's something different from having something in your head and having to put it into words. Suddenly you see things that you've written and you're like, oh, that's what I've been thinking, or oh, that doesn't actually make sense now. I've put it on the page, and I've been kind of I need to rewire the way I'm thinking about the situation.
And do you journal? Do you find journal helpful to you?
So I do have a diary I occasionally write in. I was discussing this with my husband yesterday, in fact, that when I was younger, if you were to look through my diaries there, you would just hear about all the misery, because I tended to write, and the same for him, when I was down, and when I wasn't, I didn't tend to write. So I do occasionally journal, but what I do mainly is kind of what I was talking about, is to write about my problems, or an issue I'm having. And it could be a personal issue, it could be a writing issue. And I just kind of write it all out and see where it goes, and kind of I do eventually get a solution from it. So it's quite handy. So that's kind of a different type of journaling. But yes, I do still use that.
And anything else, any other tips you want to share with listeners about your mental health and what you do? How do you keep yourself well?
Well, I think especially at the moment, in the current restrictions and the pandemic, it's been really important for me to have a kind of a bit of a practice. I'm not saying that I've got a good practice that I've fully embedded yet, but I'm reading a lot of books about kind of personal development books, as well as kind of the research books for my novel. I've tried meditation, and I would like to try that more, because I always feel better after meditation, but I do then forget to do it. So it's finding the time again to do these practices. And just, I think we've all had an opportunity just to slow down a bit. The majority of us, the ones of us who haven't had lots of work to do and haven't had family at home and haven't had feeling like they're juggling lots and lots of things. I've definitely not had the same engagements I would normally have. I would have a lot of writing engagements and meetings and stuff. That's all been cut down, and I think that's given us an opportunity to slow down. So I've now reassessed what type of things do work for me. So like the writing out my problems, meditating when I can remember to do it, exercising, all of these kind of things that we kind of know about but we forget to do. And I think it's also really important to find the thing you enjoy, because if I do not enjoy running, my husband enjoys it, he enjoys cycling. Those are not things I enjoy. I find them quite torturous. I've learned that I do like yoga in short bursts, and I do like rowing. So I've got a rowing machine at home. I mean, I think mainly it's to do with the fact that I can sit down and exercise. But those are things I enjoy. So I do enjoy, like I said, I do enjoy meditation when I remember to do it. So I think finding things you can enjoy and not feeling like you have to do it just because someone's told you to have a practice. Mm-hmm. Are the things that we can explore now, especially, and find out what do we enjoy and try and incorporate that in our new normal world.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I love that. I have a rowing machine because I like exercising sitting down. And so, Mahsuda, one of your lockdown projects was to create a free online writing course on your YouTube channel. And I wanted you to let listeners know, if they want to know more about you and your work, how would you like people to do that and contact you?
So I do have my own website, which is www.mahsudasnaith.com, which has all the information about my books and my YouTube videos. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, though I am having a little bit of a break from that at the moment. So that would be the main way of finding out about my work and getting in contact. The YouTube was really something I wanted to do in lockdown when I felt like I was useless. I think we all at the beginning of lockdown felt like, what are we doing and how can we be useful? So that was my kind of contribution. So there's 12 very short videos in a series that people can access for free, which it was important as well, because I think just having something to do, especially at the beginning, like I say, was really important. But yes, you can contact me by all the normal streams of social media.
And I would say, anyone, check out Mahsuda's videos. They're absolutely brilliant. So if you're thinking about dabbling in writing, or if you've got something locked away in a drawer or on a shelf and you want to dust it off and revisit it, I just think it was absolutely brilliant. Or even if you're a bit like me, you know that you're not very good at writing, I think they're really inspiring videos. So thank you so much for joining us, Mahsuda, for your time, your insights, sharing about your lived experience, your cultural insights. It's been so valuable, and I hope to anyone listening that you feel ready to take action. And also, if you're not a writer, but to remember the microaggressions and the sort of stereotypes and assumptions we've talked about, and how will you make an effort to kind of bust myths and think about things differently. And so thank you again, Mahsuda.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in the next episode, where we're going to be celebrating Diverse Minds podcast's first birthday. See you in the next episode, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.